Hello and welcome to On the Cube Leadership Podcast, Episode 1. This is our first episode and you are here with Craig O'Sullivan and Dr. Rod St. Hill, where we're going to be looking at current events in pop culture, in politics, in business, in ministry, and also looking at things in the Bible and interpreting what they mean for us as leaders. Now, we are not social or political commentators. We don't know in-depth information about these topics that we're covering. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at these events and draw from them what we know and what we can learn to become better leaders so that we all can learn, live, and lead on purpose. Now, Dr. Rod and I speak every week. Even though we're on opposite sides of the planet, we made sure that we stayed connected every week, and our conversations are full of, chatting about everyday events and what that means for our business and our life, and especially interpreting into leadership. And so we thought, well, you know what? This conversation is so rich and so helpful that I just want to record these conversations and share it out so that you can hopefully learn from this as well. A little bit of background about myself. I am the founder of OnPurposeCUBED, a leadership development program, and you'll be able to see lots about that on the way, where we are actually on a mission to eradicate poor leadership by raising up the next generation of influential leaders. And Dr. Rod St. Hill is actually one of our board members. He's a director of our company, as well as he's a coach in our organization. But most importantly, he is the businessman's pastor. Yes, he's a pastor of a local church. He is a doctor of economics, spent a lot of time in higher education institutions as a leader, as a lecturer, running departments, running institutions. And it's incredible to have his knowledge and experience. Dr. Rod and I have been friends for many, 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 many years, probably going on almost 10 years now. And it is honestly such an honor to be able to share this moment, or these moments that Dr. Rod and I have, and share them out with you, because he is honestly one of the wisest men I know. And so let's get into this. Before we get into this, let me hand it over to Dr. Rod to introduce himself from his point of view.
Well, I don't know that I can add much more than that, Craig. I think you set me a bit of a standard to reach for. But yes, I've had over 40 years experience in higher education, in universities and in private higher education organisations. My background is in economics. That's where my undergraduate degree and PhD were. It's a long time since I did my PhD, so I don't know how much of that is relevant now. For the last 25 years, I've been involved in academic management at one level or another, including being a professor and pro-vice chancellor at a public university. I've been CEO at a private higher education institution in its startup phase, which was really quite interesting and exciting. I'm now a pastor, more or less full-time. I still dabble in higher education, but I've just got a real passion for showing people how the Bible really provides for us a pattern for the way in which we make decisions, the way in which we behave, particularly in the context of business. And I love chatting with Craig. As he's mentioned, we catch up on a weekly basis. We're scheduled for an hour, but often we go well over time because we have much to talk about in the context of business, in the context of leadership. And, our hope is that as we share some of these conversations with you, you will be challenged and you will be encouraged to grow in your own leadership. And also, I hope you'll become a more confident leader because you better understand the biblical basis for your leadership.
That's great. That's great. Well, I think that, I mean, look, obviously, Jesus, the greatest leader that's ever lived, he taught through parables and through stories, and for us to be able to learn metaphors from those stories, so that we can live better and lead better. And so, I think that's kind of the basis of our podcast, is just looking at everyday events as a metaphor. Like I said, we're not experts on these topics. There's obviously a lot more that goes into the back end of these things, and there are amazing political commentators that do amazing, incredible research and talk about the actual event. What we want to do is just look at the event from a surface level and kind of interpret and see what we see as leadership failures, leadership successes, and things, maybe how we would do things differently if we were in that position. Once again, not knowing all of the information that is available. However, let's get into the first one. We'll always start out with something that's happened in pop culture. And at the time of this recording, one of the biggest things that's happening in Formula One, yes, I love watching Formula One. My brother-in-law loves Formula One. He's gotten me into it. I've always enjoyed sports. But Dr. Rod, are you an F1 fan?
I can't say that I am. I'm not certainly not opposed to it. I'm not opposed to any kind of sport, really. There's not much room in my life to be watching these things. I do enjoy watching all kinds of car racing when I have time, but I very rarely have time to sit down and watch television, to be honest.
Great. So, look, let me share with everyone a little bit of the update. Now, most of you probably would have heard all these stories, but let me share it with Dr. Rod. Now, during the Formula One takes a summer break, right, for a month, and what they do is they call that silly season, because that's when all the contracts are up and the contracts are due to be re-signed for the next season, which is kind of a weird time to be signing contracts in the middle of a season. I don't know, it kind of I feel it would distract me, but this season, this silly season, has definitely lived up to its name. And if you don't know anything about Formula One, I'm sure you've heard about Daniel Riccardo. Yes, obviously an amazing Australian racing driver. We can rep Australians on this show. But this is a big story surrounding him, but actually, he's the kind of the headline because he's now without a driver or without a seat over the next season. But let me just tell you about the turn of events that have led up to this. Now, Daniel Ricciardo is, in his second year, halfway through his second year of a 3-year contract, and with McLaren racing team. And just recently, Sebastian Vettel announced his retirement. And actually, a little bit of an interesting aside note. I don't necessarily want to get too political with this, but I find it interesting that Sebastian Vettel was able to announce his retirement and say it was for family reasons. He said, look, I just want to spend more time with my family. And that's incredible. But then Serena Williams announces her retirement, that she wants to spend more time with her family, and it's a negative thing. And she tries to create this whole, woke culture around, she's been oppressed because she's been making these hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and she can't spend time with her family. And it's funny how two people can actually announce a retirement from multi-million-dollar, careers, and both for the same reason, but one approach it positively and one approach it negatively. What's your? I know I've sprung that one on you, Dr. Rod, but what's your take on that situation?
Oh, look, retiring for family reasons, it's great. A lot of people can't do it, of course, because they don't have a lot of financial substance behind them. But my question would be, why do you need to sacrifice family in any case? And it's a difficult thing. It's a balance, but honestly, you should have a discussion with your spouse about it, and you should know that your first role is to be a mum or a dad or a husband. I'm not saying that there's a hierarchy. I know that sometimes you'll hear a teaching there is this hierarchy: God first, family second, job third, church fourth, or whatever. I actually think what happens is that what's important changes. Sometimes there's nothing more important than family. You know, sometimes there's actually nothing more important, just for a moment, than the job if there's a crisis or whatever. And I actually believe, you see, we find God and we build a relationship with God in the context of family and in the context of our job and so on. So there isn't a hierarchy. And I think we need wisdom to know where our priority ought to be at any particular point in time. So I think if you're saying, look, you know, I've been working hard, I've been doing this, I've been doing that, now I want to give some more time to my family, I don't, that worries me a little bit. And you often hear, say, politicians do that as well. They've been in the parliament for 10 or 12 years. They say, now I want to give more time to my family. I realise it's a very, very difficult job, but guess what? Most jobs will absorb all the time, energy and effort and talent that you can invest in them. But you have to say, well, okay, there is a line beyond which I will not go. And I've done that in my career and perhaps paid a bit of a price for that, but I've never regretted it. So, yes, and then to say, well, you know, I'm doing it because I've had all of these things going against me, that's the kind of thing either you don't need to say or keep it to yourself, because you really don't want to get into a debate about whether or not all those things are true anyway, do you?
Yeah. I think I just find it interesting that two people can make pretty much the same announcement, and one can make it a positive thing, and the other one has to kind of draw drama around it. Yeah. Because it's your choice. It's your choice in that season It is. Especially to operate at an elite level. There are sacrifices, and I suppose that's another thing that as leaders we need to. I mean, you know, Jesus says, you know, when you who of you who's going to build a building isn't going to sit down and calculate out the costs before you build it, because you don't want to be halfway building something and not be able to deliver on it. But you know, we as leaders, when we're pursuing a big vision, we need to sit down at the start and count the cost. Count the cost of, you know, with our family, and sit down and get the agreement from everyone, all key stakeholders, and say, look, this is going to be the cost. I'm going to pursue my, be the world number one female tennis player, and it just means that I'm going to have to put off having kids or wait till off seasons to be able to get pregnant or whatever it may be. But you know, it's a choice, and we need to count the cost of what we are called to, because God never said that our purpose and our calling was going to be easy. He never said there's not going to be sacrifices, and there are always sacrifices. It's just about balancing those sacrifices and, I suppose, acknowledging and counting the cost along the way.
That's right. That's why I think it's very difficult to live your life according to a hierarchy where you say God's number one, family's number two, job's number three, church is number four, hobby's number five, or whatever. There isn't a hierarchy. As I said, the priorities shift. And where you need godly wisdom is to know when, at what time one or other of those is actually the priority. Look, I've worked in a job where there are lots of issues in the workplace, big challenges. I used to have to work far more than the standard working week, if you like. I used to often go into my office at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, but I had made a commitment that I was always going to be home for breakfast with my children who were still at school. I'd always be back home for breakfast. We'd have breakfast together. They'd get ready for school. I'd see them off to the bus stop. So I was always home then, and I was always home at 6 o'clock at night. So I'd be with them for the evening meal as well. And I never worked weekends. Now, there were some times when I simply had to, maybe 4 or 5 times a year, but I'd made this rule that I'd work as long as I needed to during the week, but my family were going to have priority on weekends. I used to go to work after church on a Sunday night often and work through the night. I had this thing, well, I work when my family's asleep. But I think they would attest to this. I was home for those important times. Family times, meal times are important. And I was always there to help my kids with their homework, although the principal of the school our girls were at did ask me to stop helping my daughter with her maths homework because the results were getting worse and worse. but at least it was a time of fellowship. So we do need a lot of wisdom, I think, Craig, and yes, I cringe a tiny little bit, I must say, whenever I hear someone saying, well, I'm retiring for family reasons. And I wonder often whether they might have been able to manage the demands on their time a little bit better rather than get to the point where it's one or the other.
Or they're using that as the reason because they don't want to say that they're not performing, that they had a failure that's being held in secret or whatever, some might just use it as an excuse. But on your point about the hierarchy, there's one thing that I always like to say, and this is the last thing we'll say about this and go back to our actual topic that we're going to talk about, but here's a little bonus one for you, is yes, you're right about the hierarchy. I don't believe it's a hierarchy. I believe there's tensions, right? That we're kind of surrounded by all these things, and there are seasons where we're pulled towards one way and pulled towards the other. But I feel like we need to make sure the way I use it as a metaphor is we're surrounded by all these things and we've got a rope that's attached to each one of them and attached to us. Sometimes it pulls us one way. Family might require us a little bit more right now. It doesn't mean we drop the other ropes. We need to keep tension on those other ropes, but we need to let them go. Just we need to release them a little bit so that we can be pulled. And we constantly need to find that balance. So yeah, but let's get back onto our real point about Sebastian Vettel retiring, creating this major vacuum with drivers in the F1, because as you know, there's only 20 seats, and so it's only the best 20 drivers in the world. I think it's an incredible competition in that fact, but that created a vacuum, and so he retired, and Fernando Alonso then got the seat from Alpine, and then went to Aston Martin, which is where Sebastian Vettel was. And then that deal was done without Alpine knowing, the Alpine racing team knowing. They didn't know it. And so as soon as they found out, because it was announced publicly, they then immediately announced that their reserve driver, another Australian, Oscar Piastri, was going to take their seat. And then Oscar Piastri sends a message, puts a post on social media and says, "I'm not driving for them next year." And so there's all this stuff because he's now gone to McLaren, which has now forced Daniel Ricciardo out, and there's all these issues and with contracts and everything like that. And I could go on with lots of details, and I actually have to credit the race. So the race is it's the-race.com. They're the people that I usually watch on YouTube for all my F1 updates, and they've got lots of details, and I'll link the video below anyway so you can see all the details. But pretty much what happened is it was this snowball effect of there was deals being done without people knowing about it, and there was all these deals, like it seemed like 3 or 4 deals in a row that were done behind people's backs that no one knew about. What's your take on that as a leader? Because I understand that, well, you can't let everyone know your plans. You've got to keep your options open and everything like that. But I kind of feel like there's a sense of deception around this, and obviously we don't know all the details, but just from an outside, and I see this in businesses all the time where leaders are doing secret deals behind people and employing people to positions without other people knowing and things like that. What's your take on whether that is a valid thing, and if so, like, what's your take on that? Whether we should be able to do things in secret? How can we do that where we're still protecting, but it's with integrity and not deception? What's your take on that situation?
Well, look, a lot of us are in these kinds of situations in different environments, and what's going on with F1s. Of course, we see it in a lot of sporting codes. Here in Australia, of course, it happens a lot in the major leagues as well. And secrecy, confidentiality and so on, I don't know that that's a particular issue, but it seems to me that what is an issue here is more its integrity. So I think that the stakes we're talking about here are not so much about being open or secret, but they are about integrity. And as I was thinking about this, you know, I recall the discussion that Jesus had with the Pharisees about oaths. And, you know, at the time that Jesus was on earth, when he was living here on earth and having all these discussions with the Pharisees and others, people were, in a sense, living according to the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. So, for example, it was quite common for people to swear an oath by heaven rather than by God, because they thought, if I swear the oath by heaven, I kind of can wriggle out of it if I need to. But if I swear an oath by God, then according to the letter of the law, I'm stuck. I can't get out of it. And this is where Jesus makes that statement, which is so often quoted, about let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, he was saying, listen, you've got to have integrity when you're making an oath, or in our case here that we're talking about now, when you're signing a contract. So I think the real issue actually is in business, in the context such as we're talking about here, in sport, which is a business, of course. I think it's the entertainment business that most sports are involved in these days. But, you know, you're talking about contracts, you're talking about personal commitments and so on. So I really actually think that what we need to consider is, what does it mean when we say yes or no?
Yeah, that's really good.
Are we going to stand by our yes, even if it might cost us personally, at least in the short term? And, you know...
That's actually... That's actually, like, let me... Yeah, jump on that, because I think that's a really good point, is if you're looking at the situation, so Oscar Piastri was contracted to, now there was a clause and they missed it by a day or two and everything like that. And there was, you know, obviously he's trying to get a driver's seat and he was only a reserve driver and everything like that. So he's trying to look for his best future in the career and stuff. And so I kind of get that, but, you know, Alpine had invested billions into his development and there was an agreement. There was like, well, let's grow together. We will help develop you and help you grow into the future. And now he's done this kind of underhanded, not illegal, like not a, like he's kind of right. I mean, there is a dispute about it, but he's within his rights to pursue his own, but he is not letting his yes be yes, right? And
yeah, look, I think,
and although he's chasing that benefit of a seat right now, he's now going to be known as that person that his yes isn't yes. And kind of going on the point of Daniel Ricciardo, if you actually look back, before, like when he left Renault and came into McLaren, he kind of did the same thing. It was an underhanded thing. He left before he was meant to and all that sort of stuff. And it's kind of funny that, I suppose, some people call it karma or whatever. It's like, well, he was kind of sneaky and deceptive of his way out of there and into McLaren. And it's now he's been deceived on his way out. And it kind of reminds me of like when we first planted the church campus, and you knew me very well. I was living with you then. I remember a pastor sharing with me, actually Pastor Shane Cunningham, who you catch up with quite often.
I do.
He sat down and he said, you'll have people come into your church, but just be careful. The way that they enter is the way that they'll leave. Because people will come into your church or organization as a leader and everything like that, people will come in talking bad about their previous job, about their previous boss, about their previous church, about their previous pastor or whatever. And he said, guaranteed, if they enter into your organization talking bad about the people that they just left, guaranteed they will be exiting your organization talking bad about you and complaining about the exact same things with you, which I saw time and time again. And it kind of seems like Daniel Ricciardo's living that out now, and Oscar Piastri's kind of setting himself up for that. What's your sorry, I did cut you off on that.
It's a reflection of, if you like, the worldly system, where we get focused on what's legal and we don't ask the question, what is right? And I think we might touch on this a little later on too in some other context.
Yes.
Now, I've often said to people, listen, you do what is right because it is right, not because you might be rewarded. Yep. So it's not an issue of weighing up the benefits and the costs and so on. And I think this is the point that Jesus was making. Let your yes be yes. Don't qualify it. If you say yes, it's yes. These days, of course, most people don't do business deals on a handshake, right? They exchange very, very long contracts. But guess what? There are also lawyers who are employed to find loopholes in contracts when somebody wants to back out.
Yep.
And I think this is what Jesus was saying. Don't live that way. There's a better way to live. So I think, and of course, we don't know all the ins and the outs. We don't know all the stuff that hasn't come into the public arena in this case or in any other for that matter. But I would still argue that I think what we are seeing here is that people are basically saying, well, what is best for me, particularly what is best for me in the long run? And the worldly system would say, actually, that's okay. Most of the time, it's okay to do what's best for you. You'll hear that advice often, do what's best for you. And that's one of the outcomes of the kinds of philosophy that we live by out there in the world, because the world really teaches that I am the most important person, and therefore my needs that have to be met, and it's my future that is the most important, and so on. And I think that is what then provokes us to look for the legal loopholes or whatever. I think it diminishes us a little bit, and if we want to maintain our integrity as Christians, we really need to avoid that kind of thing if we possibly can. But doing the right thing will often cost us, and we might not actually be compensated in this life. We might not see that compensation until eternity. But we always need to ask ourselves this question: what is the right thing to do in these circumstances? And regardless of what your contract says, even though you might legally be able to wriggle out of something part way through, if you've said, look, my intention is to be here for 3 years or whatever, then if you came to me for advice, that's what I'd be saying. Well, let's sit down and work through what is the right thing to do. And even if the right thing costs us, let's do the right thing.
That's good. That's really good. Let your yes be yes, and let's live to our word.
That's right.
Not just a contract.
And you'll find that discussion, it's an interesting discussion that Jesus had there with the Pharisees, and it's in Matthew chapter 5 if you want to go and have a look at it.
Great. Good. Thank you, Dr. Rod. Well, it kind of, talking about going behind the back and everything like that. Let's move on to the next point, politics. Let's talk about some political leaders. Now, once again, we are not political commentators, and I'm not the most knowledgeable when it comes to politics. Try to keep myself as well informed as I can, but But there was a story that I noticed. Yes, so even though I live in the Dominican Republic, I still keep up on my Australian news. And there was something that hit my radar a few days ago. Now, all these things are obviously at the time of this recording. There's obviously going to be changes by the time it's been released. But at the time of this recording, a few days ago, maybe it was about a week ago, there was a news article, lots of news articles about our former Prime Minister, ScoMo, good old Scott Morrison. Now, he has been up to some, they would say, some dirty tricks. Now, once again, we don't know all the story. We don't know the real reason behind it, but it was very interesting when I was putting this together and looking at the F1 and all these behind the scenes contracts and everything that are being done, that it was funny that when we talk about politics that Scott Morrison had done something very similar. Scott Morrison has been accused. Don't know exactly what the extent of everything is at the moment because he's still under only accusation. There's investigation and everything. But apparently Scott Morrison had appointed, during COVID, while he was Prime Minister, had appointed himself as Minister of 5 different departments without anyone knowing. Now, apparently, like we were saying before, legally, apparently it's right, but it's not with integrity, I suppose, the right way to say it, and not even his ministers knew. Now, his argument about the situation was, well, I was doing it because COVID was this thing, and if any one of them got COVID, I could step in and take over and everything like that. And if that was his intention, Dr. Rod, if that was his intention, then wouldn't have you just done it with the notice of the minister? What's your take on? First of all, what's your impression of why all this happened?
Well, it seems to me that it happened for purely pragmatic reasons. It all started during COVID, and of course, as we know, most governments around the world paid no attention whatsoever to their infection disaster management type plans. So in the case of Australia, as I'm sure in many other countries, there was a pandemic management plan. Australia's had been updated as recently as 2019, I believe. But for some reason, we looked at what China did, and everybody decided to follow China with lockdowns and all sorts of restrictions on freedom of individuals. And, so we all experienced something that the Chinese people experienced under the hand of the Communist Party. And politicians everywhere became, I guess, very pragmatic, and maybe they saw some opportunities to gain additional power. We certainly saw this in Australia, at both Commonwealth, but particularly at state level, where most health regulations sit. We had state border closures, which were unconstitutional, but the courts waved them through anyway, on the grounds that we had this pandemic and that it was a pragmatic thing to do, which really surprised me because I didn't really understand that that's how the law worked actually. But anyway, that's what happened, and maybe some legal professors might correct me on that. But as I understand it, these border closures shouldn't really have happened constitutionally, but they were kind of waved through by the High Court here in Australia. So there was all sorts of things happening which were unusual, undemocratic, and didn't follow the agreed plans for managing pandemics. And as was the case with the state premiers here in Australia and with leaders in many other parts of the world, our Prime Minister did some things which were unconventional. And
That's a very political way of saying it, Dr. Rod.
He did indeed become minister in 5 different areas. My understanding is that only 2 of them were really secret, as it were. By that I understand that the ministers concerned didn't know, so they didn't know that there was another minister who could overrule them. And the only other person who would have known, I believe, would have been the Governor-General, because the Governor-General in Australia is the Queen's representative. We're not a republic. We're a Commonwealth nation, and the Queen is actually formally the head of state, and she appoints a governor on the advice of the Prime Minister of the day. So the governor is the Queen's representative, and it is the governor that actually swears in ministers in the federal parliament. But they do that on the advice of the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister can bowl up to the Governor-General and say, look, I'm the Prime Minister, my advice is that you should swear me in as the Minister for this, that and the other thing, and away it all goes. And as we so often hear in political areas, there was nothing illegal about it. And the current government, which is of a different political flavour, they've actually had legal advice which says just that. There was nothing illegal about it, but it did actually breach what have become conventions in terms of the way in which our parliament operates. And I think this raises the issue I touched on a little earlier. It might be legal, but is it the right thing to do? And I've got serious doubts about whether or not, particularly in the case of the two ministers who did not know that their Prime Minister was also Minister of their portfolio, and as Prime Minister being senior to them, he could actually overrule any of their decisions. Now, interestingly enough, part of Scott Morrison's defence was, well, I never actually used the powers, although I did once. But what interests me is the one time that he did overrule, a minister had nothing whatsoever to do with COVID. It had more to do with a looming election, because he used his powers to overrule what was likely to be a decision by the Minister for Resources, I think it was. And that was in relation to gas drilling just off Sydney. And the Prime Minister, in his capacity as Minister for Resources, actually said no to that gas drilling. We believe, and the political commentators have said, it was because he thought it was going to lose votes in certain key seats in metropolitan Sydney. Now, they lost all those seats anyway. But I just found it interesting that although his reason for taking on those ministries was in the event that the minister became ill or even died from COVID, there'd be a seamless sort of transfer of powers, or there would be a seamlessness about it, because he would just simply step in and start making decisions until such time as he'd be able, presumably, to allocate the portfolio to somebody else. I can't really see why the ministers didn't need to know and why Cabinet couldn't have known. Cabinet, keeps things secret. I do understand that under the pandemic conditions, maybe there were some things that needed to be kept from the public so that we wouldn't panic. So I wouldn't have a big issue with that. But what seems to me to be a significant issue is that the only time he ever used those powers, in my opinion, had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with COVID. But interestingly, now there's going to be an inquiry, but the inquiry really is all about what the Prime Minister did. And I just think that's ridiculous, frankly, because the inquiry we actually need is an inquiry about everybody during the COVID pandemic, not just what the Prime Minister did, but what all the state premiers did. We had long and very damaging shutdowns. They didn't do just economic damage. They did social damage. They upset the fabric of our society, and they did psychological damage as well. The psychological damage in particular is only becoming apparent now. And the other thing too, of course, is we're now getting data on excess deaths. And I suppose the most or the best known is what's coming out of the United Kingdom at the moment. But I believe we've had something like 10,000 excess deaths in Australia that can't be attributed to COVID. They're now being attributed to things like delayed diagnoses and treatment of cancers and so on, because people were locked down. There was lots of stuff that wasn't going on in our hospitals and so on because they were setting aside beds and wards to deal with potential COVID cases. I think we need a broad-ranging inquiry, not just about that. And I think what's actually happening is being driven by political objectives. People basically want to do as much. I think what we're seeing is a government that wants to do as much damage as it can to the previous government through their prime minister. And I just think we shouldn't be wasting taxpayers' money on that when the inquiry we really need so that we can discover what lessons are to be learned is a wide-ranging inquiry. I would say we need a royal commission. We need to know what was going on the part of the premiers and the chief health officers, as well as the prime minister. But I think the fundamental issue really boils down to this. I personally, I'm sick and tired of hearing politicians saying, but what I did was legal, because that isn't the big issue. The big issue is, was it the right thing to do under the circumstances? And look, there has to be room for debate on this. I don't think I can point you to a couple of scriptures in the Bible that give a definitive answer. And look, there are times when our political, business, church leaders and so on, they have to have a degree of confidentiality. But in this particular case, I find it very hard to understand why that couldn't have been cabinet confidential, that somehow it was impossible for the Prime Minister to divulge that information to anybody else. I mean, what might happen if the Prime Minister died of COVID, you know? Anyway, those are my thoughts. And as I say, look, we don't know all the ins and outs. We don't know everything that happens in Cabinet and so on and so forth. But it does seem to me that the primary issue here is that whole issue, again, of distinguishing clearly between what is legal and what is right.
So let's look at, let's pull this back and what's relevant to leaders, the leaders that are watching, and they're in business, in churches, maybe they're in politics, or maybe just in general community, etc. So I think from my interpretation of this is at the base of it, it's going behind the back and not telling, like some of them knew, but let's focus on the ones that didn't know. There should be no reason why you as a leader should be doing something behind the back of someone who has authority over that area. Maybe it's a team leader, maybe it's a manager, maybe you're the business owner and you're doing something behind your manager's back, or you're doing something that a team member has authority over, but you're doing it behind their back or whatever. For me, that comes down to trust, a lack of trust. Number one is if you as a leader are doing things behind the back of the person who's responsible for that task or project or responsibility, you obviously don't trust them enough to be competent in their job. And on top of that, you doing that is now diminishing their trust for you, because now that this has come out about Scott Morrison doing this, no one can trust him. It's much harder now. Like, obviously it's been politicized and everything like that, but now you look at him and you go, you may have done good, but now you've just kind of ruined your reputation. We can't trust you because you've done deceitful things. How do we as leaders avoid doing things that show, trying to think about, because it's not necessarily that they're showing that distrust. The leader obviously doesn't trust the person. So what do you do when you don't trust someone to fulfill their role or fulfill their responsibilities?
Well, if you love them as you love your neighbour, you should go and talk to them. I think that's critically important. People have got to know where they stand with you. And, the thought that was going through my mind as you were speaking there is that a really important role of leadership is empowerment. Now, look, every textbook I've ever read about leadership places significant emphasis on the role of leaders as influencers. And that is important. If you're not influencing people, then you are not a leader. But exactly. I also think leadership is about empowerment. So it's about giving people the authority to make decisions as well as holding them accountable or holding them responsible for the outcomes of those decisions. But to find out after the fact that your boss can actually do your job and overrule every decision you've made, it's kind of retrospective, I know, but I think that's hugely disempowering. And one of the ministers involved publicly stated that, in her opinion, Scott Morrison should resign from the parliament altogether. In other words, she's saying his level of integrity is so low that he shouldn't even be in the parliament, even as a backbencher. He's not on the shadow ministry. But that might have been a little bit over the top. I'm not sure that should be the way he responds, but I can certainly understand it, because he was a minister,
the sentiment,
doing the best
that's the way she feels
could under the circumstances. I've heard a lot of interviews with this minister. I do believe she was doing the best she could under the circumstances. She's a genuine and sincere person, and then discovers that her Prime Minister had the power to overrule any decision she made, COVID or no COVID. That is hugely disempowering. And I think that's the main damage done here. Now, the other thing, and this has to do with the flexibility or the capacity of a leader to actually lead. If the Prime Minister knew what he had done, and that it could be seen as lacking in integrity there or operating in secrecy, there's no way he could have called out the state premiers for doing something similar. In other words, acting in secrecy or lacking integrity. And he didn't. You see, I mean, I think many of us, we were looking for the Prime Minister to say to the premiers, "What are you doing? Look, it's almost certain that some people died because they couldn't get across borders. Almost, and the way I say almost certain is there haven't been any court cases, as far as I know, to actually test this. But there's certainly cases that came to the attention of the media where babies desperately in need of urgent treatment weren't able to get to the closest specialist hospital because borders were closed. And health officials said, no, we're not going to allow you we're not going to lift our rules just for you. There were families where people were dying of cancer or other terminal illnesses. They couldn't see their loved ones. It was just dreadful. No good reason for it. But the Prime Minister wasn't calling the premiers out, and perhaps one of the reasons why he wasn't was that he felt he couldn't because he'd already compromised on his own integrity. Now, I'm not accusing him of that, so don't get me wrong, because we don't know enough of the facts to be able to say that. But in terms of leadership, we need to be very careful we don't put ourselves in a position where we can't deal with issues because we've made a compromise ourselves. But I do think the biggest issue here is that a really fundamental role of leadership was undermined, and that is leaders not only influence people, leaders really need to empower people. I don't think you're a good leader if you're not always looking for ways of empowering the people whom you influence.
Definitely, 100%. 100%. We need to, people around us need to grow.
They do.
We need to see, people need to benefit around you. And if they're not benefiting, if you're taking things from them, how are they going to grow? Going back to you saying, have a conversation with them, because that's your job as a leader.
Yes,
if you don't trust them to do that role, then it's your responsibility to help build up their ability, build up their confidence, build up their experience, and train them. It's our responsibility to train them so we can trust them to do that. And if it wasn't, and if it's not a lack of trust that we don't trust them to do that, it was just a power grab, well, that's once again going back to that other thing, like it'll all come to bite us in the butt eventually, because if you can't stand up with integrity, and like you're saying, he couldn't do his job properly, and we can't do our job properly as leaders if we not with integrity. People say you got to walk the walk if you talk the talk. Like you've got to, you do have to live that out. I think it's an overused term, and I actually, unfortunately, see very few people in the public eye. They talk the talk, but it's very rarely do you see them walk the walk. And this is just a perfect example of that. Is that Scott Morrison obviously wasn't able to walk the walk as the Prime Minister and lead during this time, because he obviously was I hate to over spiritualize this, but being led by a spirit of deception. If he was doing deceptive things himself, he was being blinded to, or maybe avoided calling out because he didn't want a spotlight being put on him. And that's the same with us as leaders, that if we don't have integrity, if we can't stand with a spotlight on us, with Jesus, like we're going to be standing there. The Bible says that we that have been called to lead people actually have an extra question to answer for Jesus, that he holds us to account for the people he's held us responsible to. And if we can't stand up with integrity, saying, yes, we did everything we could. Now, we're not perfect. I'm not meant to be perfect at all, but we should be able to at least go, you know what? I did my best. I did the best with everything that I had available to me. And yeah, if we as leaders are lacking that trust, then we can't lead effectively, and we can't influence people effectively because they lose their trust in us. So
trust moves quickly,
that's a good point.
Trust moves quickly. In fact, Stephen Covey Jr. has written 2 books about the speed of trust.
Yes.
I'll tell you what, it's a very important currency in business in particular, and you can waste it very, very quickly. And look,
let's talk about that, because that's a good transition, because let's talk about business. Our topic today for business is actually based on trust. Again, I kind of did curate these things a little bit because it was a little bit on a bit of a theme. So I thought, why not carry it on? Yeah. So recently there was an article that spoke about QANTAS. So yes, we won't always be speaking about Australian politics and Australian businesses, but it just seemed that at the moment that QANTAS, they say that their morale is dropping, and they're threatening strikes and all that stuff that the unions do, but they're talking about all these challenges because all the workers are under great scrutiny. As we know, all the airlines during COVID, cut back on staff and everything like that. There were a lot of people that weren't employed or weren't being paid for a season, but stayed, stayed committed to the airlines. They specifically talk about the engineers that work on the plane, the most important people to make sure that the plane is safe. And these engineers all got their hours cut, their pay cut, like all their benefits cut, and like they struggled. They worked extra hours to make sure that the planes were safe and everything like that, even during these difficult times. And then there's this big uproar because now their CEO, and also all the executives and everything are all getting these multi-million-dollar bonuses and everything like that, while all the workers are being pressured and worked hard and cut wages and cut shifts and everything like that. Look, I have nothing wrong with executives being paid well. I've got nothing wrong with that. But how do you find that balance between paying executives at a level and all the workers underneath suffering and being paid less and having all their benefits taken and all that sort of stuff? Like how can we find that balance? Because I kind of look at it as like, in one side, I look at the engineers and go, yeah, I understand you're upset. They get these multi-million-dollar payouts or bonuses and stuff like that, and you guys are all struggling. But then I look at it and go, yeah, okay, so it's a few of them that got a couple of $1 million or whatever. If they were to spread that out amongst all the engineers would have all got an extra $20 each or whatever. Like, so how do you find that balance between rewarding people at the right level and making sure, I suppose this is another point, is making sure, because I think this is one of the biggest challenges that most business owners and business leaders find, is they sacrifice themselves. They don't pay themselves well, but they pay their staff and everything like that. How do we find that balance between making sure that we pay ourselves and as leaders reward ourselves and compensate us for the sacrifice and the pressures and the stress that we have, while keeping the people we're leading happy and not feeling disgruntled because we got a bonus or we went on a holiday or we bought a new car or something?
I'll tell you what, you touched on a really, really big issue, and we could be here for a long time talking about this. I've taught in economics in a Christian higher education context. In business, we need to sell at a just price. And that means we need to be paying just wages and making a just profit. Now, it's easy to say that. Working it out in practice is very, very difficult. As you mentioned in the introduction, my background is in economics. I do actually think that markets on the whole do a pretty good job of settling those issues. They're not perfect, and some markets don't work all that well for various reasons. But generally speaking, because the market wage and the market price and therefore profit is really driven by productivity. That is how efficiently an operation is run and how efficiently workers actually contribute to the company and so on. So I think as a general principle, freely operating markets work fairly well to deliver justice in terms of business. Now, that's a generalisation, and all sorts of things can intervene to actually undermine that, not the least of which is monopolies, not the least of which is either unions who are very powerful or bosses who are very powerful, because they can actually thwart, if you like, the forces of economics, the forces of the market that are at play. Now, I do know a little bit about airlines. I love aeroplanes. I've followed the fortunes of airlines over a long, long period of time. It's a very, very hard industry in which to make any profit at all. Margins are tiny. Look, if you're flying a jet aeroplane, say, between capital cities, state to state or whatever, you've really got to fill that aircraft before you can make a profit. So what you've got to do is you've got to fill every seat as best you can, carry as little fuel as you possibly can, because it is very, very expensive to carry fuel. It adds weight, but generates no revenue. So the margins are really, really thin. In the case of Qantas, their latest financial data was released just a little while ago. They actually made a loss in their last financial year of $860 million. So, getting up there towards $1 billion. Now, to be fair to Alan Joyce and those senior executives, during the COVID lockdowns, you might know that the Australian federal government closed our national borders, and that virtually brought international air travel to a halt. Even Australians who were trying to get home, they couldn't get home because there were no airlines flying, and if an airline did fly, they were charging very, very high prices, like tens of thousands of dollars to fly from, say, Europe back to Australia. So, and given that Qantas has, most of it, or a major part of its business involved in international flights, they were crippled. They lost a lot of money. Now, both he as CEO and the senior executives, for a time, they received no pay at all. They didn't receive any bonuses. So they kind of wore some of the pain themselves, and I think we should give them credit for doing that. The other thing is, and I think this is a big issue in big business in particular, because of the nature of the airline business. It's not a good market. The airline market isn't a good market because there's a lot of government interference. Most governments, financially and in a regulatory sense, support their national airlines. They subsidise them directly, or they organise the rules of flying to and from their countries in such a way as to favour their national airline. So nothing in the airline industry really is determined purely by what we economists call market forces. There's a strong tendency in the airline industry to keep pushing costs down. And that's why you end up having some pretty serious disputes between unions or the workers on the one hand and the bosses on the other. Now, you raised the case of the engineers. You need engineers. They do nearly everything, including making sure that if an oxygen mask falls down from overhead, that the jolly thing is going to work, right? So they've got to make sure they're properly stowed and certify that each one of these is going to work. And they've got to obviously certify that the plane is safe to fly. And in other words, until the plane gets in the air, essentially, your engineers are the most important people. Once it's in the air, of course, it's the pilots who've got to make all the decisions. But
the air hosts, because we need to be fed and we need a drink.
Well, yeah, that's important too, but it's even more important that you don't fall out of the sky. To be honest, as I understand it, the claim for wages they made, it was 12% over 4 years, it's actually more than that, because they were saying it's 3% a year. So when you compound that up, it's probably closer to 15%.
Yeah.
But given the current inflationary environment we're in, the likelihood that that's going to stick around for 3 or 4 years, personally, I don't think it's an outrageous claim at all. I think, the airline should do all it can to try to meet that. But on the other hand, you've got a public that doesn't like increases in airfares. Airlines have got, they're facing much higher prices for their fuel, and that on its own, of course, is in large measure caused by government policies that are being implemented to deal with global warming, climate change as they call it these days. So the increases in fuel, which are very important to airlines, are largely caused by government policy in the first place. So the airline industry is a mess, really, and it's really difficult to apply that rule or let the market decide, because there's so much interference by governments. There are very few aircraft manufacturers in the world because it's so expensive to develop new models and so on. So there's a lot of pricing which is determined by things other than market forces. And so when that happens, there are many, many opportunities for justice to kind of fall by the wayside. I will say one thing, though, and this is a reference to Southwest Airlines. Now, I haven't been following them closely in recent times, but I know that for their first 32 years of existence, they never failed to make a profit. And their long-term chair, and I'm sorry her name escapes me at the moment, but she said this: it's the job of the board to keep our staff happy, because if they're happy, our customers will be happy and the airline will thrive. And I do think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Now, you don't keep your staff happy just by giving them lots of money. Survey after survey has shown that, in fact, staff would give up some pay increases for other things which make them feel more important, more valued in the context of their work. And I think this is partly what the engineers union has been saying here in recent times. Our morale is at rock bottom because of the way we've been treated over the last period of years. And really, when it's widely known that a major objective of management is to drive down costs, it definitely has a morale effect. And then that flows through to the way in which staff actually interact with the public.
So how how do we reconcile this as a leader? That obviously leading an organization, whether we're leading a business, leading a ministry, leading our family, we do have to manage costs. We need to be compensated, and as a leader, I think that a lot of the time, CEOs are, and leaders of organizations are kind of, they cop a brunt, the wrong end of the stick, so to speak, that they get paid so much, everything like that. But the value that they bring is immense. The pressure and the stresses, the hours that they put in, and the value that they bring to an organization, like someone like Alan Joyce, he has so much experience that he makes one decision and the organization will either make an extra $100 million or lose $100 million. So there's big pressures and big results. But how do we, and you've mentioned that, keeping staff satisfied is not just about the money. And that's a good point because it kind of leads us on to a next point. But before we get on to that, how do we reconcile the fact that we are compensating ourselves, we're taking the time for ourselves as a leader, we're taking time off like we should, we look after our car and get a nice car and get a nice house, and we can live within the relevance of us talking about the sacrifices we need to make as a leader. But how do you reconcile that balance between making sure we compensate ourselves while keeping costs down in our organization or keeping to a budget and all of those kind of things?
Oh, look, whole university courses are designed around these kinds of questions. It's not something that we can deal with all that satisfactorily in a short period of time. But look, if your leadership context is ownership of a business, I think there are some principles we could apply in terms of your decision about how much to take out of the business, say each year or each quarter or whatever. Number one, you need to pay yourself a wage. In other words, you need to be compensated for the time and effort that you invest in running the business. And if I can share an anecdote, some people in my church came to me because they had an opportunity to buy a business. And look, I went around to the business and I sat there. It was actually a fast food service business. The place was immaculate. The current owner kept it absolutely immaculate. You could do open heart surgery there. It was so clean and everything was stainless steel and it was great. The staff were good. They obviously had pretty high morale. I didn't think the location was very good because it was tucked away at the back of a shopping centre and you'd have to find it rather than, it finding you, so to speak. Yeah. But anyway, we were able to get a look at the books and they were making a profit, right? And of course, the business is making a profit. And I sat down and said, yeah, but you know what? What that amounts to is that you and your wife together would be paying yourself a wage each year of $36,000. I said, don't buy the business. And my question to them was, would you, both of you, work full-time for somebody else for a joint salary of $36,000 a year? Of course not. So don't buy the business. So you like in the early days, you might make a loss, but you need to make sure your business is earning enough to pay you the same kind of wage you could get with your skills and experience and qualifications working for somebody else. So that's one thing. The next thing, you may have actually put your own finance into the business, or you might have gone and borrowed from the bank. So you need to be paying yourself enough to meet either the equivalent interest on what loan you would have had to take out or the loan that you actually have taken out. So you have to add that to a salary. And then in addition to that, of course, you need to add a premium, if you like, for the fact that you're a risk taker and that not all your risk is going to pay off. I've known many fine Christian people who have actually gone bankrupt at some stage in their career, and I don't believe it's because they fell into sin. I don't believe they were incompetent, but they made a decision which didn't work out for them in the market. And you might say, oh, well, if you're led by the Holy Spirit, you'll never make a mistake. Maybe that's true. Maybe you can persuade me in that way, but you could also come under spiritual attack. The devil oppresses you. He's wanting to rob you of the blessings of your business and so on and so forth. And there are many reasons, but every decision we make doesn't pay off. And so you do actually need, as the leader who owns a business, you need to be drawing from that business not just the equivalent salary that you'll get somewhere else, not just an amount which is going to service the loan you either have or might have had, but instead put your own finance in. You need also to have a premium in there, which accounts for the fact that you're the one who's carrying the risk. Now, that's what I would say, that's a just profit, right? I think that's something you can easily justify. And if you're not actually making a profit that does those things, you really should look at whether you're running your business properly or that you should get out. And if you're making way above that, then maybe you're falling into one or two traps. Either you're exploiting your staff and you should be paying them more, or you're running the risk that you're actually making your business unsustainable into the future. So you need to balance those things. Now, it's more difficult. Sorry, you keep going.
Oh, no, you finish your thought. I'm just
more difficult if you're not the leader and the owner. If you're working, say, as the CEO of a private company, or you've been employed as a manager by the owner, you don't have the same leverage in terms of making those decisions. But and if you're employed as a manager, you're not taking the risk that the owner takes, et cetera, but you should still ask yourself the question, am I being paid pretty much equivalent to what I could be paying if I went and worked for somebody else? That I think gives you a bit of a handle on whether or not you're being paid justly.
That's good. It kind of reminds me of a conversation that we had, I'd like to say recently, but I don't know how long ago it was that we had this conversation, but, about being paid too much. These executives, they're paid a lot, and there's a lot of money that flows around, and obviously it can be justified because of the value that they bring. But we've spoken about this. You as a board member of the organization, I came to you and I said, how do I make sure that I'm not chasing the money? Because obviously we're a very missional based business. We are a for-profit business, but we're very missionally based. We give away our training for free and everything like that. And so we're very missionally focused on our mission to eradicate poor leadership by raising up the next generation of influential leaders. Just to throw that in there again. But, we're a for-profit business, and I believe that this will be extremely successful. How do I make sure we stay stay focused on the mission and not be drawn to the money? And we came up with the idea, and something that's done quite often is you just predetermine how much you need to earn. And like so we've made an agreement, as directors and me as the CEO of the organization and the managing director. I said, look, this is how much I need to earn per year, and I'm happy with that. No matter how big the organization gets, how successful it gets, I'm able, and we agreed on an amount, and I actually said a lower amount. And you're like, actually, no, you probably will deserve and need more than that. So we adjust that, and that's our set goal, and that's all I need. And so that enables me to ensure that I can stay focused on our mission, but also continue to grow and be successful in the organization and funnel all of the funds back into the mission, fund it back into employing our staff, enough staff so that staff aren't overworked, paying them correctly, training them, giving them the training and the skill and upskilling them and the support and the equipment that they need, so they'll have the right tools and everything like that. And spending more money on marketing to expand the mission and everything like that. So I think that's kind of, I would say, one of the one of the main things that I would say in this, in this story about QANTAS is maybe as a leader, predetermine how much you actually need. Obviously, account for inflation and all those sorts of things, but make it amount. Pick a number and just go, well, my life would be amazing if we had this much. Set it and just go, that's how much we need to earn as a family and to achieve all the things, send the kids to school and to save for the future and buy a home and all those basic things that you need. But if you're able to focus on, set that aside and then focus on the mission instead of the money, then it doesn't become a point of, oh, well, I'm going to pay more and I'm going to buy another expensive car and I'm going to do this. And then your staff are going, what about us? I think that if we can set something reasonable with wise counsel, which is, part of the reason why I have a board of directors is so that you guys can, give me wise counsel around things that is not just me being a maverick and me, serving my own self and, get yourself some wise counsel, get yourself advisors, get yourself coaches or whatever that can help guide you and make those decisions. Preset it so that when you are making $1 million a year or maybe a month or whatever your business is making, it's no longer an issue because it's already been predetermined. And so, Dr. Rod, I want to jump on to what you mentioned about staff satisfaction or let's say team satisfaction is not just based around money. And money was actually, I remember when I first started coaching about 11 years ago, I saw a stat that, out of the top reasons of why people leave a job, money was actually lower on that list, lower in the top 10 than you would actually think. And it kind of leads us to our next point of talking about this, some research that I can't remember where, I think you referred me to it, or I think I found it and you said, yes, I know of that. The research was some research by Barna, and they're a research organization that do a lot of research around, church and a lot of statistics around that. And what they found is that over half, 51% of pastors. Now, this is a United States study, but it's with my experience with pastors in Australia and in here in the Dominican Republic, I would say it's fairly consistent. And obviously, you as a pastor can echo this, Dr. Rod. That 50% of pastors say their number one reason or their number one concern in church is the fact that the younger generation, young adults are leaving the church in droves. It's this kind of like this, pandemic that we don't, that's kind of unspoken of, is that young adults are leaving churches across the world, and at least 34% said it was at least in their top three, not their number one, or their top concern. Now, going down, throughout all this research, it actually leads to the fact that they suggest that it's through a lack of leadership training, and that kind of well, yes, we would love to be the answer to that, to the solution to that problem, providing free leadership, faith-based leadership training. It's reassuring to know that what we've been called to and what we believe is the answer is actually being touted as the answer. But it's not just about the leadership training. Going back on your point earlier that employees, staff, followers are not necessarily there for the money. They're there because they want to feel appreciated. They're there because they want to be valued. And training and developing someone, investing in them, is one of the key ways you can make someone feel like they are valued, feel like that they're important to you. And obviously, you invest in them, especially when it comes around leadership development, especially in the church world. That's probably one of the key skill sets. And I think that is one of the greatest areas that you can develop in a church is leadership. There's plenty of opportunities for you to develop. But how are we actually developing, and what sort of training are we actually providing them, rather than just some leadership experience? But valuing these people and investing in them with leadership development, with us, you have to pay for it because it's free, but not only does it make them feel valued, it benefits us as well as leaders if we're investing in the people that we're leading and seeing them growing and seeing, because if they're rising up as better leaders, then only naturally are they going to be performing better in their roles and everything like that. So, Dr. Rod, what's your thoughts around, going back to what you originally said around, people need to feel valued. It's not just about the money, and how can we do that?
Well, I agree with you. People do need to feel valued, and I think it's just part of how God has created us. God is a purposeful God, for example, so people do need to have a sense of purpose. We need to feel that we're competent. We need to feel that those around us do value us. And I think often people's experience in church is a little bit different to that. Now, Look, I'm not interested in just slicking off at churches. It's a tough gig, let me tell you. Being a pastor is a tough gig. Managing a church is a tough gig. Making sure you've got the financial resources to pay all your bills, that's pretty tough. Dealing with all the people issues that come up, that's pretty tough as well. So if you're listening to this and you're a pastor, I know how you feel. It's not easy. And I also think this problem that we're looking at, the young people leaving the church or not engaging in church, it's complicated. It's not just about leadership, and it's not just about leadership within the church. We know from the research that regardless of what kind of the quality, if you like, of Christian upbringing that young people have had, they tend to go through a stage of questioning their faith. That will happen, say, towards their late teens and into their mid-20s. And I know there used to be this idea, well, send your kids to a Christian university and this problem won't happen. Guess what? It happens there as well, because this is a stage that people go through. And I think what's happening is young people, and I applaud them for this. They're getting to the point where they're saying, I don't just want to inherit my parents' faith. I want to know if this thing is real. And so that's what starts the questions. That's one issue. Another is that young people will often emulate the older people they see around them, including their parents. And if parents themselves are not well engaged with their local church, how can you expect the young ones to be engaged? The fact of the matter is that the research shows that for large churches in the United States, I don't know what it's like for small churches, but typically a person attends a large church once every 6 weeks. So they've become consumers. They're not investors. They're not investing in there. They're going to church when they don't have a better offer. That's essentially what it means. So young ones see this behaviour in the adults whom they see as leaders. The adults influence them. How can you expect them to show a high level of commitment? The third, and I think this is one that the church itself has a lot of influence over, is how often do you see internship schemes run where essentially the young people are used as slaves? They don't do work which is particularly intellectually stimulating. They get to do menial tasks. They don't have much agency in the sense that they don't get a lot of say over what it is they do. And I fail to see how these roles actually spiritually mature these young people. And certainly they don't really teach leadership. They might teach a few principles of followership by accident, and I think followership is something we need to teach as well. It's not all about leadership. There's a thing called followership as well. My local Christian bookshop, I did a study. I did a bit of research one day. There were over 400 books on leadership, and I found 2 that you might loosely classify as books on followership. So, we've got to sort that balance out. But I don't think we are genuinely providing leadership development for young people in the churches. But that's not that won't be the solution in its entirety, young people leaving the church.
No, I think the challenge, and just on your point, like once again, we're not bashing churches, they're not developing it. It's because we're all called for different purposes, and you're a local pastor and you're called to lead your church, not to be a leadership trainer, a leadership coach. You're called to pastor, or some are called to preach, some are called to, be evangelists, some are called, we're all called to different things. And that's why we want to offer this program for free and partner with churches and everything like that, is because let us do what we've been called to do, and we release you to do what you've been called to do. Right. But it's not, you're right. It's not, well, yes, we lead toward the leadership development because that's our kind of arena. It goes back to the fact that, actually, you were on the point of the young adults are leaving church because they're on a discovery. They are hungry, and I believe that young adults nowadays, I mean, you look through all the generations, and all young adults have always been in search of something, in search of good, and like you see the hippie movement, and through all the generations, every generation has had their go of like discovery and trying to do good and everything like that. But I think that there's a little bit more intention with the young adults of nowadays, that if we're not showing them where their purpose is and where their value is, and help them discover what their life is within the church context and within, not just within the church context, but what their life is and what their purpose is out in the world and their contribution to the world, they're going to go searching for that elsewhere, and they're going to be attracted to places that feed a void that they have, right? Because, like it comes back to that thing of what we're saying is the people we're leading need to feel valued, need to feel encouraged. And if there's a void, if there's something unfulfilled in them, then they're going to go pursuing that somewhere else, whether they're an employee, whether it's a church member, whatever it may be, whether it be your children that you're trying to lead. If there's a void, they're going to go and try to search to fill it. So how do we make sure that we are providing for the needs of those people we're leading, Dr. Rod?
Look, if I knew the answer, I'm sure I'd have a church of 10,000 people, and 7,000 of them will be under 25 years of age.
Yes.
It's a difficult thing. And look, I know that a lot of evangelical Pentecostal churches, what they try to do is to match the culture of the church somewhat with the cultures that are drawing these young people. And I actually don't think that's a really bad strategy.
Yeah.
Often churches are criticised because of the lights, the loud music, and lights, smoke machines and loud music. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. I think the mistake that we sometimes make is that we leave it there.
Yes,
so we're not
agreed.
Leadership, helping people find purpose and discover their leadership qualities and so on, that's really part of discipleship.
Yeah.
And there has been some research, I'm not sure whether it was the Barna organisation or someone else, but there's some research that suggests that one of the issues is that young people are not actually putting roots down in their local church and in their faith.
Yes.
In other words, they're getting their theology from the lyrics of the songs that they sing in church. And most of the lyrics today, and again, I love a lot of this music. I'm a sound guy. I've done sound in church for a long time, and I keep trying to talk people in. We need to have a 100 decibel service.
Yes, I love it.
And the music's loud and there's lots of lights, and I love it.
Yeah.
Where you've got this bass beating out. I think it's great. Mm-hmm. I think it's great. But the problem is, though, that's in a sense an attractant.
Yeah.
That in itself is not developing people. It's not that in itself is not helping young people discover purpose. It's not helping young people develop their skills as influencers and understanding the importance in leadership of empowering those around them. And they don't always see that modelled either. I'll tell you why. Because they're pastors, they're youth pastors and senior pastors and so on. I haven't come along to you and gain some of the wisdom that you have. And, of course, as you know, one of the reasons why I'm involved with your organisation is that I believe God has given you something which the church needs. God wants to get it out into the church. So I've got no problem at all, really, with what many criticise as sort of bringing that outside culture into the church. I don't have a particular issue with that. But I do think that we've really got to work on this whole issue of helping young people discover their purpose and also of helping them come to grips with those really important keys to leadership of influence and empowerment. And just briefly, one of the other things is, generally speaking, in the church world, we focus on what are called the trait approach to leadership. In other words, it's personal characteristics and behaviours. There is actually more to understanding leadership than just those areas. So it's not just whether or not I'm, charismatic, if people like to follow me, than the life of the party and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. There is a lot more to leadership than that. For example, we do need to be very sensitive to circumstances. And so under certain environments, under certain circumstances, we need to be more of a kind of leader, if you might say, emulating the military style in the middle of a battle. That's very, very different to leadership, where what we're trying to do is, say, develop vision and move people towards, say, changing social conditions in our local community and so on. So we need to help people become sensitive to that as well. But, all of these issues that we're talking about today, you and I, we could spend a day or longer talking about each one of them and still only be scratching the surface.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I think you kind of touched on something that then kind of leads us into our next point. But I suppose this whole issue of the young adults, exiting the church in this mass exodus, so to speak, it comes back to one of the leadership principles is let's invest in the people that we want to raise up. If we want to keep those people around us that we're leading and want to attract other people, because wouldn't you think that if you want to lead people, that if you're investing in the people that you're leading, don't you think that other people would then come and be attracted to you because they want someone to be invested? People want to be invested in. People are hungry for someone to see value in them. They're searching for it, and they're searching in other places. Why not allow it to be us as leaders to be able to invest in those people to help them grow? Now, you mentioned
interrupted you.
No, that's okay. You mentioned before that about the pastors, kind of leading in a certain way and everything like that, and I kind of feel like that is one of the challenges is we kind of do things the way they've always been done. And it kind of leads us into the next segment, and our last segment for our episode, for our first episode today. And thank you for sticking with us through so far. If you're still here, is let's look at the Bible. Let's look at some leadership principles we can actually get from here. We've spoken about biblical principles throughout, but let's go to the Bible. There was a number of probably about a year or two ago, I was doing a study through Luke, and it was almost like every verse was jumping out at me, giving me a leadership lesson, almost every verse. And I started jotting down, I took down hundreds of notes of what I call leadership lessons from Luke. And I thought, now's the perfect time to be able to share that out with the world, and we'll share some of them. And so every week until we get through all of these topics, we'll be sharing you some leadership lessons from Luke. And we're not going to be going from beginning to end. We'll pick and try to find things that are consistent with some of the other topics. And what, like Dr. Rod's mentioned, is, the pastors and the youth pastors are all leading a particular way, and we're running churches and doing things, and not just churches, but we're running organizations. We are in leadership, are doing things the way they've always been done. And that's what I believe is one of the biggest risks that we have, is we get caught up in this routine of doing things the way they've always been done and expecting a different result. And they say that, Einstein said that quote is, if you try to do the same thing over again and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. No one can actually confirm that was actually his quote, but you know what? I'm sure he said something similar to that, that could be interpreted anyway. And I feel like it's time for us as leaders to make a shift, right? To shift the way, because leadership just isn't working the way it is working right now. And we're seeing far too many being, used and abused, feeling, as we've said today, there's a whole bunch of people that are doing deals behind people's backs and mistrust and not feeling valued, because that's the way leadership is being done in the church and outside of the church, unfortunately. And there's this passage in Luke 5:33 onwards, where Jesus was questioned about fasting. And I'm not going to read the passage. You all know the passage where he says John's disciples, they asked Jesus, John's disciples are all fasting all the time and everything like that. And what should we do? And Jesus says, that's good, but you can't put new wine into old wineskins. You can't, if you've got a new anointing, a new vision, a new pathway, we need to be doing things differently than the way they've always been done. Because if you pour new wine into old wineskin, then it's going to taste like the old wineskin. The wineskin's going to crack, and you're going to lose all your wine. And so he's saying, there's a new way. There's a new way. And here's the thing. The funny thing is we refer to this, and that was Jesus saying that over 2,000 years ago, that there's a new way. And I feel like it's still relevant today that, hey, there's a new way. I feel like we've gotten caught up in a way of leadership that's not conducive to growing people, to investing in people. We kind of been caught up in this driving towards our vision and building our thing and gathering everything together for ourselves. And not intentionally, but as a byproduct, people do tend to feel used and abused and unfulfilled. And that's why you see so many people hurt from poor leadership, and that's why we're on a mission to eradicate poor leadership. But there's another example of that in Luke 6:1, where
this is where Jesus got caught out healing someone on the Sabbath.
That's right. Yes, sorry, I had a bunch of different stories running through my mind. Yes. So Jesus was caught.
You couldn't cut your toenails on the Sabbath either. There were so many rules that said this is work, and you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath.
Yeah, and Jesus refocused them back and says, "But is it better to love someone or not?" And so Jesus healed someone on the Sabbath, and all the Pharisees were sitting in the background, just going, "Well, hold on a second, that's not the way it's been done, and this is our rules, and this is the way it's meant to be done," and everything like that. And they missed an opportunity to help someone be healed. They missed an opportunity to bless someone. They missed an opportunity to help someone grow because they were stuck in their old ways. And so it's kind of as one of our first lessons from leadership lessons from Luke is, I encourage you, is stop doing it the way it's always been done. Look, there's a new, fresh way. Let's invest in people. Let's help those people grow around us. Let's not get caught up into the traditions of how it's always been done. Let's look for new ways. So, Dr. Rod, what's your take on those lessons that Jesus shares?
Well, the headings in our Bibles, I guess, point to it, that we've got to stop doing the old thing and look at the new. I've heard it said numerous times that one of the reasons why we have so many denominations is that a group of people get a revelation, a new vision, and then after that they're not prepared to change it. And so instead of a denomination developing, it stays the same and a new denomination arises. And according to some people, we've got close to 40,000 different denominations around the world now. Now, I don't think God's got a particular problem with the number of denominations, but he might have a problem with the fact that we develop a pattern, we develop doctrines and so on, and then we're not really prepared to relook at those in the light of the evidence which is coming forward. And so I think it is important that we look at what we're doing now and say, look, is there something about what we're doing now that needs to change to make us more effective in God's service?
That's really good.
Depending, I suppose, on your own denominational background, it seems to me that God's primary purpose in the world is one, that he would be glorified, because that's how the world will notice that God exists. This one true, all-powerful, almighty, all-loving God exists. And the other is the redemption of creation, which includes obviously humanity, but I think all of God's creation as well. So we need to be asking ourselves, is what we're doing today appropriate to glorify God in the world? And is it placing us in the right position and posture to allow God to use us in his unfolding story of redemption, which will only, of course, be fully consummated at the second coming of Jesus? The issue for the Pharisees here, that the issue that Jesus was really, I think, hinting at, is that because of their traditions, they had missed the purpose of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Now, me with my sort of business spectacles on, I see the purpose of the Sabbath as withdrawing from the daily grind, so to speak.
Yeah.
And if you have a look at what happened on the Sabbath, it was about building relationship with God and with one another. And so the test of whether or not someone is breaching the Sabbath rules surely must be, if they're following the Sabbath, they must be withdrawing from the daily grind of commerce and work and all those sorts of things, and they should be focusing on their relationship with God and with one another. Now, although I think the New Testament Sabbath is something different than a particular day in the week, and we see that in the book of Hebrews, but I still think there is value in us drawing aside from the daily grind, so to speak, not just doing nothing, but focusing on our relationship with God and, importantly, with one another. Now, if I've heard a pastor say, for example, Sunday church is the main thing, and I'm thinking, really? What that means is you've got all these people who work 5 or 6 days a week, and then you want to wear them out on Sunday as well.
Yeah.
I don't really think that's how it ought to be done.
No.
And of course, I personally know many people who are no longer engaged in church because Sunday church burnt them out.
Yeah.
And rightly or wrongly, in our own church, we state about the people who volunteer, we'll guarantee we won't burn you out. And that also means, as a pastor, I can't burn out either.
Yep.
And we need to understand that the primary purpose for Sunday actually isn't Sunday, it's Monday.
Yeah.
I believe strongly in how important it is for the church, that is the people of God, to gather together in local assemblies on Sunday or Saturday or whatever day of the week your tradition identifies. You need to do that. That's what we call the church gathered. Very important, because we thrive in community. We need that community. But what we need to recognise is that we're sending our people out for the other 6 days of the week.
Yeah.
And one of the things about leadership is that the leadership of the church assemblies needs to understand that it's not, they're not here for our benefit. We're here for their benefit. We're here to equip them for the works of service that God has. And that's what purpose is about.
Yeah.
We're here to help them find their purpose as ones who are sent out from the assembly.
Yeah.
And I think, well, we don't want to get too theological, but often people say, well, ecclesia, that word ecclesia, that's about the people who make up the church, and therefore the institutional gathering together is not really all that important. I disagree with that, because actually the ecclesia refers to people who are assembled for a purpose or who are called out for a purpose. So I don't see how you can dismiss that institutional gathering together in an assembly of one kind or other on Sunday or Saturday or whatever other day it is. I think that's important. And part of the reason why we do that is to help our people find their purpose when we actually send them out into the world. I don't know whether that's a good answer to your question, but
no, it's good. Like, I think that the leadership principle here is actually really important. Is obviously not doing things, going back to like the original point of not doing things the way that they've always been done just because the way they've always been done. I think it's a very good point that you bring up about the denominations. I make this observation a lot, is that yes, these denominations, they get an amazing revelation and then they just get stuck almost in a time capsule around this thing. And it's like the Bible clearly says we all know in part and prophesy in part. So why couldn't we, like, I believe I've been given a fresh revelation, a new revelation, a new wineskin around leadership. That doesn't mean I negate all past leadership principles and stuff like that. No, my revelation is simply building on. But there's been incredible influences. You know, people like John C. Maxwell and Dave Ramsey, and there's incredible giants of the faith that have incredible leadership programs and incredible leadership experiences. I'm not negating any of their stuff and saying, well, their way is wrong and my way is right. No, their way was great. I believe that we've been given a fresh revelation of that, and I'm building on what they've taught. We base a lot of our principles on their things, but then take it to the next level. It's not, that stuff is no longer worthy. This is the only way to do leadership. It's like, no, we all need, I'm standing on their shoulders. And that's kind of what leadership should be. I hope that I set a foundation that eventually people will get another revelation. They'll stand on my shoulders. That's what I hope. I hope that they then carry it forward in a new revelation as well. Because we've all got something to add, not necessarily become a silo away from, God, Paul writes that we're one body but many parts. We can't operate in isolation. We're all kind of there to be able to help and build and grow on that. But the other leadership principle that you then led into, which I think was beautiful, was taking a break. It is so important for us as leaders about rest. Let's say rest, because that's what the Sabbath is all about. I know for me as a leader, when I'm kind of caught up and with too many commitments and too many things to do, and I don't rest properly on on the Sabbath, on Sunday or whatever day's your Sabbath, if I just go to church and then I come home and then I have to get work done or happen to be out and catching up or do anything like that, if I don't actually rest on Sunday, I'm okay for the next week. Maybe if I miss it the week after, I'm starting to deteriorate. I notice that over time, if I'm not getting that weekly rest, like spiritual rest, I'm grumpier. I'm not as patient. I don't lead my family. I don't lead my wife. I don't lead my organization properly because I start getting tired. And so it's really important for us as leaders to rest. But also we need to, you mentioned about, us, in ministry causing people to serve on Sunday as well. So they're working 5-6 days and then working on Sunday as well in a volunteer capacity. I don't believe that that's isolated just to the ministry. It's obviously highlighted in the ministry, but I believe that there's a lot of leaders in organizations, whether it be business, corporation, volunteer organizations, that we tend to forget that we need to manage the rest of the people we're leading as well. I remember when we planted the church campus, there was one thing that I was very adamant about, and I was very protective of my volunteers, of my team, because I wanted to make sure I managed their energy levels. I understood that it was my life. The church was my world. Like, I lived and breathed it, but I know that they had other lives to go home to. And so I actually set a rule in place that whenever I appointed someone to a volunteer role, whether it be leadership or even just volunteering in a role, I set out like a very basic roles and responsibility and position description that just simply outlined, this is how much hours I'm expecting you to spend on Sunday. This is how many hours is expected during the week. Can you commit to that? And then on top of that, what I did is I only allowed people to ever serve in one area. Because most people get caught up and they're like, I'll serve on the welcome team, and then I'm on the worship team, and then I'm, in kids ministry or whatever. But then you're getting, every week you're serving somewhere else. And obviously we're talking church context, but this goes in organizations as well. You have to, as a leader, you have to manage your own rest and manage the rest of the people you're leading, because I guarantee you, they won't speak up for themselves. They look up to you as a leader. They've kind of sacrificed and kind of thrown themselves on the sword, so to speak, for you. And that's a responsibility that we carry as a leader. We need to be very, very careful that we don't take advantage. I know you don't intentionally mean to take advantage, but we can easily take advantage of these people because they are attracted to you as a leader, your energy, your charisma, but also the vision that God's given you. They're attracted to that. And so we have a responsibility to manage their energy levels as well. So
we do. Yes, we do.
So look, we've been going for a lot longer than we were expecting to. Like Dr. Rod said, we always tend to go over. So this has been an incredible talk. And look, if you want to learn more like leadership lessons and leadership principles from a biblical perspective, from Dr. Rod and myself, and other people from our team will be joining us as well here on the Cube Leadership Podcast. Please, would you consider subscribing? Like this video if you've seen some value in it. And hey, if you're wanting some leadership development for you, for your team, for your church, for your organization, I encourage you, jump onto OnPurposeCUBED.com and check out our free leadership development. And I'll put all the links and everything below. But Dr. Rod, as always, it has been an absolute honor sharing with you. Thank you so much for you sharing your wisdom. And hey guys, if you've got any questions, any comments or ideas about the things that we've mentioned, put a comment below and we'd love to be able to hear what you say. But we look forward to seeing you next week in episode 2 of On the Cube Leadership Podcast. Have a spectacular week.